Okay, I think we're starting. Very big welcome to everyone who's joined us today, joining from all over the world, no doubt, much as we are. Thanks for choosing this session over so many other interesting offerings happening at the same time, kicking off World Water Week, which is happening in Stockholm at the moment. My name is Sarah Ransom. I'm the General Manager of the Australian Water Partnership, and it's a very, very great pleasure to be hosting this 1 hour, very fast session, but there's going to be a lot in this, which we're really pleased to have the opportunity to share. And I'd love to say as well that it's great that this session can be run online, which means that there's some voices here from all across the Blue Pacific, and it's free to access, which is great. So big thanks to Seaway for their efforts to increase inclusion and the ability of people anywhere to be able to get access to this knowledge for free. Before I'll start, I'll just acknowledge that I am joining this session from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, Australia. The Ngunnawal people are the traditional owners of the land where I am working. And I'd like to acknowledge that this is their country, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging, and thank them for their continuing care of country and community and waters. So this session today is highly relevant. It's a session that builds on some research that's been going on for the last few years. It's a forthcoming publication, so you'll need to keep an eye on AWP's social media and on our website to see that coming out. And the topic of it is, as I said, highly relevant on water and food security in the Pacific. I guess at this stage, I won't talk too much. We have some fantastic speakers to share with you. But for me, it's really important that we're here today and learning from the people that we've got to speak about how important the interconnections are between water and food, particularly in the Pacific Islands. So I really hope that you enjoy the speakers that we have on board today. They're a brilliant and fantastic group of people, and we're so pleased to be able to share. Before I move on, I'll just say quickly our session structure today is we have the speakers, and then we'll move into Q&A. So we hopefully have about 20 minutes of Q&A time. I would encourage anyone to just put some comments, say hello to others on the session in the chat. Please go use the chat as much as you like. We can use that to get questions from the group as well, but we've also got the ability to have people turn their microphones and their cameras on to ask questions directly. So we'll do that when we get to the Q&A time. Okay, that's enough from me. And I will now turn to our first speaker, who is Gordon Nanau, who's from the University of the South Pacific. Dr. Gordon Nanau, he's a senior lecturer in the discipline of government development and international affairs in the School of Law and Social Sciences at the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. Gordon is a wonderful speaker, and we're so pleased to have him here today. So I will hand over to you now, Gordon. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining in. I'll be providing the some background information just to set the scene. So let's move to the first slide. So when we talk about the Pacific in this discussion, what we are really talking about is that massive group of islands, and that includes the Polynesian group of islands, the Micronesian group of islands, Melanesian group of islands. So the Pacific covers that range. So obviously there's a lot of diversity in that. Next slide, please. So given the nature of that, the brief, the map that I provided, for those of you who may not really know the Pacific, within the Pacific itself, the political systems and institutions also vary, and they deviate from the metropolitan models of government that many of us are familiar with. Tonga, for instance, is a monarchy. Fiji has a single electoral constituency, for instance, and Vanuatu and Kiribati have multi-member constituencies, while other countries like the Solomons have single-member constituencies. So there's a diversity as well within or between those countries. And at the same time, there are different ways of defining political representation at the formal government level. Who represents who, under what legitimizing process, may help determine the outcome of water, food security efforts in given contexts. There's also this, the existence of vertical and horizontal channels of communication. And I think it's important to point out that some may not be effective when making decisions relating to water and food security. What I mean is, the extent of centralization versus decentralization. You may have states, provinces, local councils, island councils, municipalities that deal with these kinds of issues. Okay, so there is that vertical and horizontal communication. And just looking at the, further to the statement I've made, you can see that when you talk about the Pacific, it's difficult to lump them together as a single group, because as you can see here, in terms of population, there's huge diversity in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of debt levels, remittances received as percentage of GDP. Those, you see all these different criteria, and again, it emphasizes the fact that the region is so diverse. Next. All right, so when we talk about water and food security, these are cross-cutting issues or services where in reality, you would have several government departments and stakeholders having a say or influence over them. And there are also various existing legislations and policies that may require review or realignment that are already in place. Okay, just to give you an example, in Fiji, when you talk about water, there are 8 ministries that you have to deal with to tackle water issues. PNG, again, you talk about urban water supplies. There are 2 state-owned enterprises that deal with that. So the jurisdiction of each actor or each stakeholder must be clearly understood as well when we engage in this area of food and water security. And that important thing as well is that the government of the day is convinced of and supports the proposed intervention, any sort of intervention that we may be looking at. But while government ministries, the formal government institutions, legislations and policies are critical for the success of water and food issues, it's also equally important to note the critical role of informal institutions at play. Okay, there are informal institutions across the Pacific that you need to be aware of. Okay, so water and food security in the region must be seen in the context of who owns land and water sources. Okay, so let's look at the next table. If you look at the table here, you would see that the state does not own land in the Pacific. Okay, most of the land, for example, the third column there, customary land, the customary domain, that's where most of the land is, except for Tonga, which is a monarchy, and therefore all land belongs to the king. Okay, so the point I'm making here is that when you talk about water and security, this is where most of the resources are. This is where, whether the project is successful or fail, it's in terms of who owns the land, who owns the resources, and how do you have access to land? Is it through lease or purchase or compulsory acquisition or those kinds of processes? So the point is that the state does not own most of the land in the Pacific, and therefore food and water resources will have to deal with informal institutions. Next. Okay. Right. So again, water and food security designs and interventions in the Pacific would differ from one country to the next because of the diversity that I've just explained, and even from one region to the other, and also uh, in a single country, maybe the rural versus the urban. So there are there are differences in these different situations. So acknowledging these peculiarities and differences between PICs and even within different parts of its country would enable the design of water and food security interventions appropriate to its context. So one size fits all does not work in the case of Pacific Island states. And I think this quotation from Curry, I think well reflects what I'm trying to explain. Development practices should pay close attention to place-based conceptions of economy and society, and losing sight of the social can and often does lead to the failure of development projects, end of quote. So that's important. I mean, acknowledging these peculiarities. So what may drive individual leaders to push for development outcomes in the area of water and food security? Again, those important points that I raised about land ownership and where the resources are, but also that leadership legitimacy in rural communities may also come from, things like culture. It may not be a formal thing. It may be determined by culture. For example, the Aliki or the Ariki in the Cook Islands, and is from culture itself. And leadership positions held in the church or in the school or community also provides certain legitimacy to leadership in rural communities. So proper communication to ensure leadership and buy-in is critical when we talk about water and food security efforts in Pacific Island countries. Okay, so coordinating the different departments and organizations and realigning legislation regarding water is an important undertaking. And in the urban areas, I think it's possible to follow the business model of doing things because state-owned enterprises provide services such as water, and also they deal with profits and things like that. But in rural and maritime communities where most of the population live and where water and food security issues are prevalent, relationships are essential. Okay, so relationships are essential in those rural and maritime communities. So respect and relationships are at the center of any development effort in Pacific Island countries and must be featured in water and food security designs. Most donor-funded interventions focus on individualism, the social division of labor, rationalization, bureaucratization, and the emancipation of the state from society, etc., will, with limited results. As I've said, the Pacific worldviews emphasize relationality, spirituality, Pacific agency, and community and nature's inseparability. Okay, so development interventions, including water and food security, must acknowledge this hybridity that I've been trying to explain on the ground across diverse and heterogeneous contexts. Okay, so important considerations. I think these two quotations from this group of authors is useful, and I put them here for you to have a look at. Hybridity is a helpful framework for grappling with real-world phenomena that in one way or another entails the interpenetration of local, indigenous, or place-specific socio-legal, political, or economic orders on the one hand, with global, transnational, or foreign orders on the other. They went on to say that the context in which water and food security interventions in the Pacific are designed and implemented would do well to realize that the market and other introduced institutions have not entirely replaced or incorporated non-market social relations and other traditional institutions. Instead, they have merged with them, often in very creative ways that enable people and communities to have the best of both worlds or agency. Okay, so proposed water and food security interventions in the Pacific should appreciate this reality on the ground to ensure success and sustainability. Right, thank you very much. In my language, it's Dokuma Mate, and Solomon's Pidgin, Tagio Tomas.
Thank you very much, Gordon. That was a really great presentation. Great to have you set the scene with your sharp political economy analysis. And I really like that you left us with a real appreciation of the creativity that's inherent in hybridity and the opportunity to work in very innovative ways in the Pacific. So thank you. The next speaker I'll hand to is Dr. Federico Davila, who is an interdisciplinary social science at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. Fed, I'll hand over right to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks, Gordon, for your introduction and all attendees this morning, or wherever you are. So on my introductory slide, please, I'll basically say that this presentation stems from a project we did in the depths of lockdown in 2021 during the COVID pandemic, collaboration between University of New South Wales and the University of Technology, Sydney, with substantial technical and advisory review from the FAO and the Pacific Community, SPC, a science technology body in the region, where we would really try to understand different dimensions of the water-food nexus in the Pacific. So in the next slide, please, I'll set the context for why water and food are important for us. Water and food security risks, as we know, are very likely to increase due to increases in human usage for water and food. And this is no exception in the Pacific region, which, as Gordon noted, the Blue Pacific is quite a diverse, very large region, even though the land masses are quite limited, but they are very exposed to a series of population pressures and climate pressures. And nexus thinking has been very prevalent in both food and water since the early 2000s, but a lot of that research has been very much focused on large infrastructure, hydropower dams, water energy nexus, and the implications for irrigation, with a less of focus on the more traditional farming practices and water management practices that are prevalent in the Pacific. So if you keep clicking through, there's been limited research into this water food nexus thinking in the Pacific region. And this is interesting because there's been quite a lot of work done in technical agronomy and in hydrology and in some geospatial mapping of water sources in the region, but very little integration of the water food nexus. Interestingly, water and wash are obviously major challenges for development, but agriculture receives up to 10 times more investment in the Pacific than water has over the last few decades. And climate change is an underlying risk and threat for the countries. So to get into the context of water and food, approximately 45% of Pacific people continue to live without access to basic drinking water, and 70% live without access to basic sanitation. There's huge differences between the very diverse countries. In Niue, which is quite small, basic water access is at 98%, compared to 37% in the very large island of Papua New Guinea. And there's a need to continuously think and adopt some of these universal design principles of wash infrastructure so that people living with disability, those marginalized from society, continue to have that basic human right that is water. In the next slide, in the context of food systems and how they're changing on the climate change and how they interact with water, agriculture is a dominant source of livelihood in the region. A lot of it is subsistence, so it stays within the countries. Some very limited agricultural exports. And fisheries continue to be very important, but coastal fisheries and freshwater fisheries are increasingly at risk for issues like pollution. Very the population is very much concentrated in coastal areas. And as Gordon highlighted, there's a very strong sense of traditional practices and knowledges and customary practices associated to land, which leads to this issue of hybridity in my bottom point in terms of having traditional governance systems and formal governance systems. So if we go on to the next slide, these are essentially the work packages in our study, and I'll just present the top one, which is the National Formal Policy Review, in which we wanted to understand how the water-food nexus is present in existing Pacific water and agriculture policies. The other three components of the work went into some deep dives into the issues of gender and water, the issue of atolls and how they manage water resources for food, and some more technical calculations into trying to understand the implications of changing climates for water availability for particular crops. So we start moving into what we found and what we did. Because a lot of the water food nexus frameworks are very large scale hydropower dam, Asia, European focused frameworks, we really wanted to develop something that was emergent from the policies in the Pacific. So as the slides progress, you'll see this grow. So there's a series of water resources in the different islands, groundwater, rainwater, surface water, which provide ecosystem services. And these are essentially used in the blue lines for human activities, either domestic use or different types of agricultural practices, noting that there's very little irrigation. So a lot of the water is actually used as it comes when it rains, or is captured in rainwater tanks for eventual potential use, with some cash cropping. But these agricultural practices are increasingly impacting groundwater resources. And in the next slide, if you click through, please, there were 4 types of nexus links that we wanted to understand. And these were links that analytically we looked for when reviewing policy documents in water and agriculture. The first link was the competition between the two sectors. The second was the impacts of climate change on agriculture and how that's mediated by water. The third was the farming practices. And the fourth was water quality and whether that has any implications for agricultural use. So what did we find very briefly? And this report's really long, and as Sarah said, will be coming out soon. So firstly, we found that the impacts of agricultural production on water quality and quantity is the most prevalent issue discussed in these policies. This relates to issues of farming practices. That was most definitely the most dominant issue raised. Issues associated with land and intensive agriculture, but also the competition between resources and agricultures that potentially substantial use of water, and the challenges associated with water allocation. There were also some more subtle mentions of the impacts of water quality on agricultural production, and these were largely related to the links between climate and water, so related to sea level rise and rainfall patterns. So if you click to the 3 points that will come up, a lot of the documents only focus on one of the 2 nexus elements out of the 4. With regards to agricultural production and water quality and quantity, agriculture policies were the ones that most consistently looked at water and sanitation as an issue, interestingly enough. But there were some obvious discrepancies on how they addressed what each sector should be doing. And agricultural policies most definitely tackle the question more systematically around the impacts of water quality and quantity for agricultural production. Then if we go to the next slide, which has 6 boxes, please. These 6 boxes are what we found to be what we call policy windows of opportunity. So noting that this is very much the legislation, governance, formal government arrangements that are in place, and acknowledging that there's a whole more bigger complexity that Gordon started to raise in terms of traditional resource management. But these 6 windows are ones that we said, if donors and investment and development wants to work within the existing public policy space, these are areas that across the policies emerged as important. To quickly go through them, planning, legislation, and regulation related to very much issues of water allocation, regulation, water legislation, and the complexities behind that. And that was tightly linked to governance and the coordination between departments. And, Gordon gave us the example of how many ministries one has to engage in Fiji if you want to progress water policies. Technology and infrastructure, so the hard investments, obviously an area of interest, particularly with technologies that can save resources and save money for families, related to issues of low-cost irrigation, solar pumping, sort of trying to find ways in which very remote communities can use technology for water and food. Farming systems and practices relating to transitioning to sustainable farming, and there were ad hoc examples throughout policies of that, how that could be done. Specific water management tools were sometimes mentioned and were seen as an area of potential growth. And very importantly, building capacity and engagement and this concept of water literacy beyond the experts that work in water and food in the countries, but also bringing that water literacy and food literacy to the growing population was seen as a potential area of opportunity. So if we go to the next slide, which are my concluding remarks and final slide, synthesizing here a report that's 50 pages on top of the other technical reports, but what we noticed is that the agriculture sector is actually a potential leverage point for building water literacy and addressing water issues. We did notice there is strong policy environment and regional interest in research and development agencies to support nexus thinking, but it to date hasn't really been very explicitly supported. There really needs to be that engagement with national level interventions, but then very much community driven and led initiatives that draw from that localized nuance and politics of resource management. A lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the policies are very old. So some of these documents were about 15 years old. Some were expired. So it was really difficult to determine what the current future thinking around this space is. And overall, nexus framing is not very explicit, but it's increasingly being called for as a way to manage water and food, given the climate emergency taking place in the region. Thank you for listening, Sarah. I'll hand over back to you.
Thank you, Federico, for your presentation and a really great reminder there about what it takes to grapple with that nexus thinking and really translate it into the context that you're working in. And again, a real appreciation for the diversity across the Pacific Islands and the different contexts that we are working in there. So thank you very much. I'll move to our next speaker now, and that is Ms. Noella Doravella, who is also a research fellow for Pacific Ocean and Climate Change Assessment at the University of the South Pacific. And she's going to be speaking to us about some fieldwork that she's done in the Solomon Islands. Hi, Noella. It's great to see you. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah. I think I have a problem here. I can't view the slides now.
Okay, we can see you and the slides are visible, I think, to the audience. Zoe will be controlling them for you. So perhaps just say next slide when you want to change.
Okay, thank you. Something just went wrong just 3 minutes ago. I can't view my screen, the screen. I'm the shared screen.
Perhaps we could ask our tech people to jump in and give Noella some advice. Noella, maybe perhaps you can start your presentation and we'll try to follow along with the slides as much as we can. You're on mute at the moment.
I can see you all, but I can't see the screen.
Okay, I'll just pass the message on and ask our Trippers colleagues. Perhaps she can't see the shared screen. Perhaps you can give some advice.
I will try to help you in chat.
Noelle, would you like to change the order of presenters. Perhaps we could go straight to Linda and then come back to you once you've got your screen
Sure.
sorted out. Yeah, thank
Sure.
you.
Thank you.
Linda, can I call on you if you're there? Linda, please let us know if you're present.
Sarah, I think Linda was here, and I'm just going through the list, and she's not here at the moment.
She's dropped off.
Sorry, yeah.
No problem. I saw her online before. Linda's joining us from a very remote location in Vanuatu, so her internet is probably not super reliable. We might just stay with Noella then until Linda can join us again. Noella, are you there? We might give her a couple of minutes just to get her screen sorted. And I might actually ask our two first presenters to come on screen. And if anyone in the audience would like to ask any questions, that would be great. But I wanted to actually perhaps kick us off. Gordon, from your perspective, I guess, as a political scientist, I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how we can work as donors and people interested in supporting Pacific Islands through that hybridity that you mentioned. And what do you think are the best approaches for donors to support local knowledge and traditional knowledge and the importance of that, but also respecting the political and institutional environments?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think the approach would be the usual approach to go through, the national government, and then from the national government, I think they can also communicate with sub-national governments, depending very much on whether these are states or provinces or municipalities. But from there, then you would have to go down to the specific context that you are interested in to work in. So, for example, if you are working in Malaita in the Solomon Islands, for instance, then you would have to spend some time to understand and engage with people where that intervention is going to take place, to understand the local dynamics, the leadership complexities, the land ownership arrangements. So it will take time, and the people on the ground, as I've emphasized earlier, the issue of relationships. So they will only be communicating with you if they trust you. So relationship that is built on trust is critical in the Pacific. So they won't be in a position to trust you if you just go in and ask who owns this land, or how do we build a water supply here. It will have to take time. It takes a bit of time to get that trust, but the formal entry point would always be the government, and of course the government, the formal institutions would have to be convinced before the connections are made to the local communities. So I think the important thing when you go down to the communities is basically understanding the dynamics, who owns what, who is a legitimate leader, because there are probably other illegitimate leaders or people with ulterior interests as well. So that is a challenge that you deal with in specific context. But I think critical is the trust, the respect that people have for you before they open up to negotiate and discuss these kinds of things, especially if it's an intervention from outside. That would be my response, Sarah.
Thank you, Gordon. And some very good principles you've outlined there about taking the right amount of time to do the work properly and build the relationships. I have a question here in the chat from Victor. Victor, would you like to just put your mic on and ask that one directly?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Sarah. And I'm so grateful for this wonderful session. It's absolutely terrific. And Gordon and Federica, you've been wonderful. I've just returned from Samoa and traveled around both islands. And there are lots and lots of aid-funded projects to deliver potable water, drinking water, particularly in tourism areas, gardens, in the villages, and agricultural water. So can I ask both of you and to you, Sarah, what makes you optimistic for the food water nexus in the Pacific? And what are some of the stories of things that you've seen that give you hope and inspiration?
I'm happy to go first, Sarah. Thanks, Victor, for such a interesting and kind question. And I know what it feels like returning from the region and from a trip and seeing everything that's happening. That's very hard to forget when you're not there. I guess focusing on what stories excite me is I did a project a few years ago where I worked with a group called PIFN, the Pacific Island Farmer Organization Network. And this is a group that is Pacific-led, Pacific-owned group of farmers, and they have very mixed skills. Some are farmers that are business leaders, some are farmers that are researchers, some are farmers that work with NGOs. And what I noticed was this project was looking at agriculture skills and knowledge exchange. And what motivated me to what I learned from that project is that this group acts as a catalyst of knowledge exchange through, I think they're scattered around 7 or 9 different Pacific countries, and they, through meetings like this, continuously engage with their farming groups in different parts of the Pacific to support them in doing the agroforestry systems they want to do or the water conservation techniques they want to do. And they're an interesting organization because they are very community driven and led, but they also work with the big funders of the UN and the Australian government. And I just found them to be a really interesting sort of organization that balances that sort of community-driven, locally driven approaches to agriculture with the realities of the complexities of funding large international projects. Many other stories like that, but that's just one of them.
Oh, thanks. Gordon, what inspires you? I mean, what are the things you see? I think you're in Fiji, so what are you seeing?
Thank you, Victor. I think for me, I did another research project that focuses on projects that are successful and leadership that actually bring change in the context of Solomons, where a lot of discussions have always been on corruption, bad governance. So we went in with a design that we're looking at what works, the projects. And one of the water supply projects that we came across was funded by a donor agency. I won't name the donor, but the design was such that halfway along the implementation, the funding and the kind of arrangement that was put in place stopped, but leadership at that local community level was such that they picked up the water supply project, and on their own they developed it to completion. So for me, legitimate leadership, the type of leadership that's recognized by people, who are respected by people, will work because of the need that they have, there's definitely need for water sanitation, as Federico highlighted in the slides. But I think a lot of time we emphasize that connection between the Ministry of dealing with water or land, without realizing that the success actually comes from identifying real, legitimate, and genuine people at the community level. And in this example, women leaders and women were also pushing for that project to be completed, and it was completed successfully. So that gave me hope amidst all the negativities that were going on in the Solomons, Victor.
Oh, thank you. Sarah, I think you're very passionate about local governance, and the Australian government's new development program is gender, there's a gender lens to it. I mean, for you, what are the stories that have brought you great hope and optimism?
Thanks for the question. I'm a little uncomfortable with the spotlight being on me because I'm not a speaker in this session. I can answer briefly, but I just wanted to check whether our final two speakers are online. Linda, if you're there, can you unmute yourself and see if we can hear you?
Yes, hi everyone.
Hi, we can hear you. That's great. We'll go straight to your presentation, Linda.
Like standing in the middle of the night somewhere in Fortuna, and the network is really, really bad. But I think I'm not really going to go through the presentation because of the network. I'll try to go through it real quickly and just speak on the main points. Why it is important to consider CHETSI when we are doing our planning, anything to do with water, right? So first of all, in the communities, all communities are different, structures are different. Not every islands have a good source of water, so it's always important that we speak to the community people when we are doing this, whoever is going to fund any water. Can you still hear me?
We can hear you really well, Linda, and your timing is excellent because we've just had a discussion on JEDSI, so go right ahead.
The important thing here for me is that, speak to the community people, speak to different types of people. Okay, so yeah, I was just saying that if any development partner or partners that are coming into, look at, access to water or whatever they're working in, that the important thing there is to talk to different people, talk to different types of people that are living in that community. Don't just go in and think that this is going to address the water issues. It's always important to talk to people with disability, women and children, whoever, and then make time to go through and look at all the different sources of water. Like what our friend Federico said, when I came in one of his points, he was talking about don't go and build something that's not going to suit the context, or the building those big things that won't even suit what the community, it's not going to be sustainable if you go in with big machines and whatnot, and then only to find out that you are just going to waste money on that, and it's not going to be useful. So yes, the other thing is, water is really important, because if we want to make sure that everyone in the community has access to water, we also need to make sure that it reaches everyone, people with disability, women. A lot of time, even I can say that with the experience with the NGOs here, they've been working in certain islands for too long, but still you can see that they have not really touched on the importance of water. In some communities, they have some sort of water project going on, and then in some community they're still buying water of their friends who have water. And for me, I am not really sure if that's the way we should be. You know, there's the excuse that there is not much funders out there who are, you know, keen to come in and do some of the projects. So I'm really happy that this session is on, you know, water, and it's taking into consideration the importance of having Chetsi. Yeah, you and I, we all know that it's the women and children and people with disability, all the people who are the ones who are always affected when there is not enough water in the community. I was just speaking recently, that was on Friday, with this mother, and we were doing some work on NFIs, looking at the type of NFIs that were distributed by GFAD. And she was saying that for me, all of these things that was donated by the Australian government, they are all good, but for me, that's not the important thing. For me, it's water. As long as there is water at home, then I'm very satisfied. And she has, unfortunately, she has two children, and they are like 14. The other one is 29, and they have this. They are both living with some sort of disabilities. The daughter, who is 14 years old, she works like long to pay for transport to go down to our town, which is called Lenakel, where she can then refill the containers to take them back home. She doesn't have that luxury, so she was telling me, please, can you just talk to World Vision or CARE, who are the two main NGOs here, if they can just, you know, consider looking into our water and stop giving us things that, and you know, we will use these things that are coming from DFAD, like the NFICS, but please, if they can consider for the next disaster, that when we have a next disaster, that our water, so we have water tanks. I'm not sure if I've gone over my time, but you know, when we are doing this, it's always important to consider talking to the people. It's always you know, good to consider the different types of water sources in the community. And yes, for now I think I'll finish here, because that network is really bad, and yeah, give that time for questions if you need to ask questions. And my apology, I'm not really going through the slides, but yeah, this is just the situation on the ground, that in Vanuatu the situation is different for different islands. Some islands are, most of the islands are tall, but yes, sometimes when you see a good water project in that island, and you tend to think that it's all the same for every other island, which is not true. So it's always good to do your homework before coming in to put in those type of different water projects that you want to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you.
If you want to.
That's wonderful. We might ask if anyone's got some questions for Linda, just to pop them in the chat. But I really thank you, Linda. You've given us a rallying cry there for more assistance on water and reminded us that it's a fundamental human right, and you need to speak to everybody, because everybody interacts with water in different ways. So thank you very much for that. I might ask if we can go back to Noella. If you can put your camera on, we'll see if we can get you to do your presentation now. Thanks.
Hi, Sarah.
Hello. We can hear you.
Hey, I think something went wrong again. I think it's my internet connection.
We can hear you and we can see you. Can you see the screen?
No, it just went off again.
Ah.
Oh, it's blank. Now I can see it. All right. I think it's my internet connection on this end. It's really poor.
Go ahead, Noella. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Can you go on my first slide, please? Yeah, the risk to water food security, this case studies in the Solomon Island. Next slide. Can you just click through it? Yes, in Solomon Island, the availability and accessibility of food and water sources varies from large island to smaller islands, rural and urban households, coastal and inland communities. Water, for instance, although the country enjoys high average annual rainfall between 3,000 milliliters to 5,000 milliliters, it does not mean water is accessible. Like smaller island, rainfall varied while groundwater is limited to hand-dug wells. Larger island, flooding is inevitable during heavy rainfall, causing damage to food gardens and contamination to water sources. Next slide, please. Can you just click through it? Today, I'm going to present a case study from inland community. Can you go back to the first slide again, please? Sorry. Inland community and coastal community. The case study one is from Alokan community in Russell Island, Central Province, and case study two is from Barona community in Gode Canal, where the Honiara is. Can you slide? Next slide, please. Alokan community. Alokan Island is a small island approximately 4 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. It is approximately 96 kilometers from Honiara. It has 42 households with a population of 246. The location of the community is marked with the red cave, as you can see in figure 2. Next slide, please. Alokan community derive their livelihood from combination of subsistence agriculture, fisheries, and selling of small-scale cash crop, mainly copra production. Next slide, please. Can you just click through it? This is one example of coastal fish catch, mainly both for food consumption and for income. Next slide, please. In terms of infrastructure, social service, and cultural belief, there is lack of infrastructure and social services in the island, like there is no access to communication and transport, and also basic community needs like health center. We have there is a community-built Catholic church with kindergarten at the back, as you can see in the figure provided. The village is made up of traditional materials. Next slide, please. In terms of water and food sources, all households at least have one subsistence garden. There is 33 rainwater tanks and 12 groundwater wells. Next slide, please. This is an example of groundwater wells used by Alokan community. Next slide, please. Food sources mainly from subsistence agriculture and coastal resources. Next slide, please. The vulnerability and exposure to food and water security is impact of climate change, especially the sea level rise. The fundamental needs are at risk, including living space, housing, food and water security, culture, health and well-being. This also threat to livelihood and human security. Coastal erosion also affect productive land, and it also impact agriculture and coastal ecosystem that the community depends on. Frequent extreme events also affect transportation of goods and services to Honiara. the only closest economic center for the community. Prolonged dry weather also affect the rainwater availability. Next slide, please. This is an example of risk and exposure of groundwater well to sea level rise and coastal erosion at Araucan community. Due to close proximity to shoreline, like less than 2 meters, 80% of the groundwater well are brackish. Just cooking and drinking is limited to rainwater supply. Next slide, please. Sea level rise and coastal erosion also affect living space and human security. Also, it affects the agricultural land. Next slide, please. Araucan community is vulnerable due to limited water sources. There's disconnection between government and community linkages, lack of incentive and development opportunities in the island, no closest economic center. Adbert Moto is only means of transportation to Honiara. The roles of women and girls are greatly affected as they are the main managers of food and water at household level. How the community cope to build resilience to adapt to sea level rise, they build their own seawall using the available local material as shown in this picture. Next slide, please. Case study 2. The Barona community is located inland northwest of Guadalcanal province. It's approximately 3 kilometers from Honiara City Council. It has population of 800 people. The community is one of the significant community in Guadalcanal as it has a historical World War II heritage and memorial site. It also has a nature and heritage park that it is established by SPREP in 2018. The figure shows the entrance of Barona community from Honiara, the city council. Next slide, please. We click through it. The figure shows where the Barona Park is. Next slide, please. Livelihood and income generating activities. Similar to Araucan community, subsistence farming and gardening is source of income. They are also supplier of local materials to Honiara residents. Since they have World War II heritage, there is ongoing ecotourism activity that provide income for the community. Next slide, please. In terms of infrastructure, social and cultural belief, although the community has access to Honiara, the main capital of Solomon Island, there is no formal economic activities within the community and no proper water and sanitation facilities. They have community resource center and Gifu Primary School. In terms of culture, the cultural stories are sacred as they are connected to the land ownership and traditional authority is derived through community council of chiefs. Next slide, please. For water sources, the community has 6 streams that feed the Matanico River. There is 2 groundwater wells and several springs. Next slide, please. This is an example of groundwater wells used by Barona community. Next slide, please. For food security, similar to other rural communities in Solomon Island, subsistence food is mainly from agricultural products. Next slide, please. Risk and vulnerability for water and food sources for Barana community. First one is climate change. Prolonged drought and heavy rainfall affect both food and water security. Deforestation due to community expansion, logging, and shifting cultivation also affect agricultural land for food production. Lack of sanitation and waste management is another risk. Invasive pests, the giant African snail also a threat to agricultural crops. Limited capacity in terms of technical and financial also limit the community to expand and improve their food and water sources. Limited water management capacity also increase in rapid increase in population and urbanization affect food and water sources. As you can see in the pixel, land use activities that threaten water and food security in Barona community. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, Noella, we need to stop there. We've run out of time, and I think our session needs to finish at 6 o'clock. So apologies that you still had a couple of slides to go. I will stop there. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm so sorry we had problems connecting you. Things didn't go quite as planned, but thanks everybody for bearing with us. We will upload the slides and the presentations to the event page on Trippus, so you can come back and see some of that incredible detail that was shared by our speakers. So with that, I'd like to wrap up. I thank our speakers very much for attending. It's quite late in the Pacific, so particular thanks to you, Noella, and to Linda. It was really wonderful to have you here and to present your case studies. And thanks also to Gordon. Wonderful to see you, and thanks for your contribution, and of course to Federico. Thanks, everybody. We'll finish there.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you all. Have a good evening and morning.
Thank you. Bye bye.